At implementation time, you were very likely given a very nice ledger import template that had mappings pre-established. And whenever you want to import transaction data, you simply replace the data on that template and click the Load Definition button on the Data Send interface to begin the process. It is very convenient and easy. But what happens if your template becomes corrupted? Sometimes that does happen to templates. Would you know how to remap it? Or maybe you'd like to become an expert at uploading data into your accounting system. And if so, you're going to need to know how to create your own mapping. Today's video has been put together with the goal of helping you learn how to take any regular old Microsoft Excel spreadsheet and import data from it into Sun Systems without using that pre-established template. Now, before we get started, I just want to say that the screenshots and examples that I'm going to use in this lesson have been taken from Sun Systems version 5.4, and you'll notice as we go through the video, you'll be able to tell because of the way the analysis dimensions are used. Now, if you're using Sun Systems version 6, you may take one look at these screenshots and think, oh, this has nothing to do with me, I can't use it because I'm no longer in version 5.4. I don't want you to think like that, because I want to point out that even though some things have changed in version 6 from version 5.4, some things remain exactly the same. In fact, most things remain exactly the same. It is true that the analysis dimension distribution is different in version 6. However, the upload process remains exactly the same, so I'd like you to continue watching this video. So let's get started. Let's say that I have a year's worth of monthly appropriation data and I want to upload it into Sun Systems as a single ledger import. I've accumulated all my data and I've set it up in this spreadsheet. I've checked my total. It balances to 0, so I'm pretty sure that I have everything that I need and I can go ahead. The first thing that I want you to realize is that a ledger import is exactly the same as a ledger entry. All of the information that you need to enter a transaction using a ledger entry, you will also need to enter a transaction into the ledger using a ledger import. All of the business rules that govern a regular ledger entry will also govern a ledger import. If a field is necessary in ledger entry, it's also necessary in ledger import. So, for instance, if an analysis code is required for postings to a certain natural account in ledger entry, that code will also be required for a posting in ledger import. This particular upload, if you take a look here in the accounting period column, is going to hit on a number of different accounting periods. It's going to post into a year's worth of accounting periods. Now, before I even get started with my upload process, I want to be sure that those periods are all open in Sun Systems and can be posted to. So I'm going to go into Sun Systems and I'm going to go into Ledger Setup and I'm just going to check out my periods. So the current period is April of 2014, which is fine. That's our current period. And the open periods for this particular system have been set up to start 4 periods before the current period. So that would be roughly January. So that looks good. And then they are going to extend 8 periods beyond the opening period. So we will look at that, and I think that looks pretty good. And the open dates also have to cover the entire range. So here we have January 1 of 2013 through December 31st of 2014. And I can exit from Ledger Setup and go back into my spreadsheet. Now I'm going to prepare my spreadsheet for the upload. As we can see just by looking at this, I already have the individual lines of data set up. I'm going to double check that I have the columns that I need. Each one of these columns should look familiar as a field from the ledger entry screen. I'm also going to need a column for the layout identifier, which we give the acronym of LID. If you look at the template that you have been using, you will notice there is an LID column in that template, or a layout identifier column. This is a very important column. The values that we enter into the LID column are going to govern the entire upload process, and we'll talk about the role that they play a little later on. We can add a column for the layout identifier anywhere on our spreadsheet, but for consistency's sake, we'd usually add it to the far left of the data. So this is going to be my layout identifier column. In the first cell of the first row of data that you want to include in your upload, you need to enter the value 1, 2. This is very important. Let me repeat it. You're going to need to have a layout identifier value of 1, 2 for the first row of data that you want to upload in a ledger import. Always. You always want that specific value. Later on, I'm going to talk about what those numbers represent and what happens if you don't get them correctly entered. For right now, we're just going to say be sure that the first line of data has a 1, 2. In every other row of data that I want to include in my import, I'm going to enter the number 2. I'm going to use the Microsoft Fill function to populate my values all the way to the bottom of my spreadsheet, and I'm going to center it just so it looks a little bit nicer. I'm going to go down to the bottom, and because I used fill, there is a 2 on the totals row. I don't want the totals row to be part of my upload, so I have deleted that 2 now. Going back to the top. Okay, so now I have 2's on every row of my data. So what happens if I leave one of the 2's off one of the rows? Well, the system is going to jump right over that row during the upload process. It's going to ignore it. It will be as if that row of data had never been entered. So, because the row is omitted, then my import is going to be out of balance and it will not be able to be posted. That's why I have a 2 in every cell in that layout identifier that is next to a row that needs to be part of the import. So now my layout identifier has been correctly set up and I can begin to map my upload. So we're going to log into Q&A Excel and we're going to select the data send process. This is the data send interface that I'm going to use to map my upload. First, I'm going to check the product line here in the upper pane on the data send interface. By product, it is identifying the application into which this import is going to be posted. And we want it to be posted in Sun Systems 5 and 6, so I will select that. Next, I double check the identity of the business unit into which my import will be posted. And we want it to be posted in Sun Systems 5 and 6, so I will select that. Next, I double check the identity of the business unit into which my import will be posted, and I want the demonstration business unit. You, of course, would want whatever the business unit is that you work in. Next, I will click on the definition line. Notice that when I click on a line up here in this top pane, the blank field here will change in identity. So if I click on comment cell, then any value I enter here will be applied against the comment cell. So I want definition. I'm going to click on the assist button and I will get a list of definitions that have been set up in Q&A. And I want to select ledger import. Next, I want to enter my layout identifier. I want to map to it. Notice that some of the values in this pane have bolded titles, and some of them have regular font titles. Bold means that that particular value is mandatory and must be entered. So for my layout identifier, I want to select the very first cell in which my data occurs. So I'm not going to select the header cell. I'm going to select my first cell of data. Then I'm going to click on error cell. Now you want to set up an error cell. And this is optional, but it's really nice to have, and I think that you're going to like it. So I suggest that you always set up an error cell. I know I always do, and I use them all the time. You can assign error cell status to any cell in your spreadsheet, whether or not it already contains a value that is part of the upload. I usually put my error cell up toward the top of the left corner of my spreadsheet so that I have a general idea where to look for it. Errors will be posted into the error cell as comments, so it will be easy to spot the error cell because of the small little red triangle that will show up in the upper right-hand corner of the error cell. I'm going to skip right over the next 3 items in this upper pane because I don't need them for this particular kind of an upload. Now let's move down to the bottom portion of the data send interface. Let's take a minute to explain to you what we're looking at here. Basically, this information here in the left-hand pane, there are 3 items. They're numbered items. I want you to think of them as tabs. Notice that if I click on the second one, all of the values here on the right have changed. So each of these is basically a tab. Each of these field names are linked to a table in Sun Systems, so they are links into specific ledger entry fields. And this is where you're going to map the data value. What I mean by mapping, which is a term that I've been throwing around a lot in this video, is the process of saying take this piece of data and post it into this field. And that's all the mapping means. Okay, let's take a look at these items in this left-hand pane. This first one, Ledger Import Header, is exactly that. It's a header. Now, because I was an English major, I think of this as the cover sheet that I would create for an essay that I have written for a class. Or it could be the title page for a book. Remember when you were in school and you had to write an essay? Some teachers required that essay have a title page. This header serves the same purpose as that essay's title page. The values that we map in the import header will create a connection between Excel and Sun Systems. Basically, the items on this particular tab have to do with the entire upload, and they are focused on the upload itself, not on the journal that's going to be created in Ledger Import. So it's less concerned with the posting than it is with the formation of this upload file. These values are very important, so don't think that just because they are not going to be posted into the ledger that you can skip them. You can't. They are very important and they create some of the connections. Let's talk about the numbers here in this pane on the left, the 1, 2, and 3. Remember when I said I was going to tell you a little bit more about the numbers in the LID column? Well, this is later. The number 1 here in the LID column relates to this number 1 here for the Ledger Import Header tab. Number 2 relates to the Ledger Import Details tab. A correctly formatted upload will only have a single LID cell containing the number 1, and that is very important. You may be wondering what happens if you were to put 1:2 into every row of data in the LID column. Well, you came to the right place to find out, because when I was starting out, I did that one day just by mistake, and what I ended up with was a gigantic mess. Because you see, for every row of data in my spreadsheet, and I had 1,000 rows of data in my spreadsheet, the system created a separate upload file for every single row of data. The file contained a header and 1 row of transaction data. So I had a mess on my hands. There were no balanced journals, and I had 1,000 separate upload files in the Ledger Import control desk. I had to clean every single one of them out before I could start over. It was a huge, huge, huge mess. If they had been balanced journals, each one of those would have created a separate journal. I only made that particular mistake once, and I'm hoping that by my confessing to you, you won't make it at all. So it's very important that you only have the number 1 in your layout identifier column once. You only need 1. So now we're going to start filling in the items here on the right side of the tab. This description is not the description that you're going to post in to the ledger with your transaction data. Basically, what you want here is a description of the upload. Something short. This will show up in the upper right-hand corner of your journal listing. You may want to keep that in mind. And you can name this whatever you want. I'm going to call it a monthly appropriations 2014. The main role of this particular description is to help you identify this upload on the ledger import side of the process. Next we go to posting type, and I can click on the assist button, and I have three options. The standard is to select post if no errors are found. And what this does is it asks the system to validate the data in the upload against the business rules and the natural account setup in the system. You could choose 0 and just validate your data and then run the import at some other time, or you could go ahead and post regardless of whether errors exist. But we're going to choose number 2, and I suggest you choose number 2 every time. Next, right to hold file. It's bold, so I need to address that, and I want to say no because in SunPlus sites we do not typically use hold files. However, if you are at a site that does need a hold file, you could select yes there. Post a rough book, again I'm going to say no. Allow balancing transactions, and I'm going to say never. The suspense account, here in the SunPlus world, we often use something like 338110 as a suspense account. You could use whatever account you wish to use for a suspense account, but that's not mandatory. You don't have to fill that field in at all. Then I can enter a default period here, but I don't have to because the periods, I'm going to be posting into 12 periods, and they have all been identified in the transaction data itself. But I can go ahead and set a default period. Report errors only. I always select yes, and I suggest you do the same because what happens is when the ledger import side of the process attempts to post the transaction data into the ledger, it produces a report. Even if there's been some kind of a failure in the data upload, it will produce a report. If you ask it to produce a report that shows errors as well as successes, you're going to have a huge report, and you're going to have to worry out which lines have the errors and figure out what they mean. If you ask it to only report errors, then you have a much more compact and easy to read report. Next, suppress substitute message is bold, so I need to address it, and I'm going to say yes. I don't want a substitute message. And here's where I pick my journal type. I also want to set my post ledger here, and I want it to go into the actuals. So these are the only fields that necessarily you need to populate in this tab. And once again, they are related to the actual import file as opposed to the transaction data. And now we'll go to Ledger Import Details. This is the second tab, and we'll do the mappings for each of the specific fields in our upload. First, I want to click on this blue line at the top of my data send interface and drag it down so that I can see my first line of data. This will make it easier for me to map. I'm going to click on account code, then I'm going to click in the first cell that has data. Now be sure that you keep your posting mapped to the same row of data, even if the row might not contain a value, like it might not in some of the analysis code fields. Because that analysis code would not be required for that account code, there might be a blank in the very first row of data, but keep that consistent or your data is going to be scrambled. Next, I'm going to click on the accounting period, and then I go ahead and I enter my mapping by clicking on the first line of the first row of data. When it comes to the journal source, notice I haven't set up. There is no column that says journal source. There is no cell that says journal source. So I can hard code this data. The journal source, as you know, is the operator code of the person who is doing this upload. And in this case, it's me. So I've typed in my code, which is JAN, although I am logged in as AOK. I'm going to hard code JAN. And when I hard code a value here in the mapping, that value is going to be applied to every single row of data in the import. Next, I can go back to transaction reference, description. Now I'm going to ignore base amount and debit credit marker here. I'm going to ignore them. That may seem wrong to you, but trust me, we're going to ignore them because in the Sun Plus world, we use fourth currency rather than the base for our uploads. And then I'm going to scroll down to the analysis codes, reference to TFWW, etc. And I'm going to map even to the analysis codes that don't seem to have any data in them here at the top, because there might be some data in one of the lines further down that I have forgotten about. I don't think there is, but there could be. And I'm just going to glance back over here very quick and make sure these are all in row 2. Now be very careful when you're mapping something like this not to just put your cell down in a random location on the spreadsheet, because look what happened. It changed my mapping for details. Okay, so you have to be careful not to do that. Just pay attention when you are doing the mapping. Then I'm going to scroll down to fourth currency, and I need to identify the code and the amount. Okay, those are both in row 2, 222 all the way up. Great. So we have mapped our upload. See, that wasn't terribly hard, was it? Now I'm going to go to the Options tab. The internal definition will save your mapping with whatever name that you give it here. I could select monthly appropriations and have that be my header. And it does work because we are uploading monthly appropriations. If I wanted to name it something else, I could just type it in here. External definition allows me to create a template if I would like and save it anywhere on my computer. So here I would just give it a name and click the Save button. I would save this either as an internal definition or as an external definition. You don't have to save it as both, but it is nice to have it saved in case something goes wrong and you need to try it again. So that's all there is to mapping my import. And now I can go ahead and use it. So I'm going to click OK. The system has found a single error, so I'm going to click OK here and go to my error cell. And this is where I learn how handy it is to have an error cell. Okay, it doesn't like the account code 338110 that I gave in the header. Remember, I set that up as the suspense account in the import header. This particular demonstration business unit does not even have this suspense code, so I'm going to delete that account. And this isn't bold, so I don't necessarily need it, so I'm going to go ahead and I will click OK again. If there were some problem with the rest of my data, I could easily repair it and then come back into the data send and continue with my attempts to upload the journal into the system. And I get a data will be overwritten message, and yes, I want to continue. And I'm told that 240 records were transferred into Sun Systems. So I can click OK and the data send interface disappears. And that's all there is to mapping. So see, it wasn't that hard, was it? Now I can go on and do the other side of my entry, but this is just a regular ledger import like you have seen in other places and in one of my other videos. So here is the one that we just uploaded, monthly appropriations. I'm going to click Review. Just glance at that and it looks like my file, ledger import process, OK. And I'm into the runtime parameters screen, which just lets me validate that my parameters are set up correctly. And I can go ahead and process my data. And it's going to tell me exactly what's going on down here in the lower left corner of my screen. It shows me where we are in the process. So basically that's all there is to mapping an import file. Because I saved it as an external or an internal, I believe I saved this one as an internal definition, I can use this as my upload template if I'd like. Thank you for coming along and spending a few minutes with me going over this process. In the next video in this series, I will show you how to easily upload a budget.